You're listening to the Angry Marks Podcast Network.
You can find us at www.AngryMarks.com, and also check out our Facebook page at The Undisputed Wrestling Show. Without further ado, I've got my partners in crime, Zane U. Paisley. How are you, Zane?
I'm doing just fantastic.
And also the NWA Continental Champion himself.
I'm doing great, man. How are you doing tonight?
I am much better than last week. Thank you guys again for filling in and holding the fort down for us. I really wanted to talk to Marion, but upper respiratory failures weren't allowing that. So here we are this week. A great show tonight. Hour number 2, we've got a independent sensation on the East Coast. Crazy Shay will be joining us. He comes with a lot of high claim. I'll be very excited to get some remarks from him and see what he's got going on.
So with that being said, tonight we have the great opportunity, the great honor, and the great pleasure of talking to the Honorable R. Bruce Tharpe. And so with that being said, Rick, I'll pass it back to you.
You know, real quick, I'm going to have a quick prophet's pulpit real quick before we get this thing started with Mr. Tharpe. For those anticipating an NWA bash, you're going to be sadly disappointed listening to this show. Mr. Tharpe does not do a lot of interviews, and he has graciously granted us one, and I consider it a privilege and honor to be able to talk to him tonight. I am a pro wrestling fan. I've been a pro wrestling fan for 40 some odd years of my life. I want professional wrestling to succeed. All the naysayers and doubters out there who like to bash the product and say that the NWA is a flash of what it used to be. Okay, granted, it's not 1984 anymore. We understand that the times and business have changed. I want to give Mr. Tharpe his platform to talk about the NWA, the business direction that he has for the company, other thoughts on things that are going on in the industry, and give this man an opportunity to talk, because he doesn't challenge back at all the naysayers who are bashing him all over websites, and I don't think it's fair. So without further ado, the president of the National Wrestling Alliance, R. Bruce Tharpe. How are you this evening, Mr. Tharpe?
Very well. Thank you very much for inviting me on the program. A pleasure to be here.
Very happy to have you. For those who aren't aware of your background, you've been a very prominent lawyer in the Rio Grande area in Texas for several years. What got you into the wrestling business in the first place?
Well, that's a long story. Before I get into that, I'd like to address the comments made by Will Huckabee. First of all, I echo his remarks about the importance about carrying yourself as a champion. That's exactly what I like to hear from wrestlers that take this profession seriously. You know, and I don't necessarily call it a business; I call it a profession because that's what it is. And with regard to his comments about Jason Kincaid, he's exactly right. If you're a champion, you're proving yourself day in and day out that you're the best wrestler in that particular area. And if Jason Kincaid is laying claim to being a better wrestler in an area in which Will Huckabee's holding the championship, well, then a showdown needs to take place. And it needs to take place in that squared circle, and the better man wins. And that's the person that ends up, with the championships. And that's why championships are very important, because they represent the best wrestler in that particular area. And we start from the top. We start with the National Wrestling Alliance World Heavyweight Champion, Iron Man Rob Conway. One of the goals that we've got for the National Wrestling Alliance in exposing the brand worldwide is to get back to the basics, and that is having a traveling world champion, travels all around the world to different countries, meeting the best wrestler in every country, and proving that the National Wrestling Alliance World Heavyweight Champion is the number one wrestler in the world today. And, so I like those comments that Will Huckabee made about being a champion, and I agree with them wholeheartedly. Now,
as far as how you got, how did you get into the business, being like I said, in the law profession? What attracted you? I guess obviously you were a wrestling fan far longer than you were in law. What got you involved in the pro wrestling industry in the first place, Mr. Tharpe?
I was born in the wrestling profession. My father was involved in professional wrestling back in Florida. He worked with Eddie Graham back in the championship wrestling from Florida days. And So my father was an announcer for Eddie Graham in Florida for many, many years. And so some of my earliest memories as a little boy are going to the wrestling matches with my dad. And I was fortunate enough to be around some of the greatest wrestlers in history back in the day. And I'm talking about guys like Lou Thez helped me when I was a little boy. Joe Scarpa, who was Chief J Strongbow. Before he became Chief J Strongbow, he was Joe Scarpa, an Italian wrestling in Florida. And Don Curtis, Hiro Matsuda, Eddie Graham, Jack Briscoe. These are the types of wrestlers that I grew up around, idolizing, to be honest. And they were at my house. They knew my mom and dad. So I was born in the wrestling profession. I grew up in wrestling. I started working in the wrestling business when I was probably about 14 years old at the Fort Hummer Hesterly Armory in Tampa. I would sell Cokes at the matches while my dad was the ring announcer. And we would finish right before the main event, and my dad would always save me a seat right next to him. So I would rush down, and I'd be able to watch the main event from ringside. Saw some of the greatest wrestling matches ever, and the greatest wrestlers ever from ringside. Bearcat Wright, Great Mephisto. I could just go on and on and on. Johnny Valentine. I got to see guys like that live. And so that's how I grew up. And I got into the wrestling profession. I started working in the wrestling office at about age 18. And that's kind of an interesting story in itself. As you well know, back in the day, the wrestling profession was very protected. The word kayfabe is very, some people don't understand what that means, but back years ago, the wrestling profession was extremely protected, and it was very tough to get into the business. And once you got into the business, you were very careful about talking about the business in front of other people. It's very secretive. And so when I was one of my hobbies when I was a teenager was magic. In fact, I still do magic once in a while. And I was rehearsing this magic show that I was doing. And I was in like a theater in Tampa. And it was during the afternoon. And my father happened to be riding around with Eddie Graham. I have no idea what they were doing, but they happened to be in the area. And so they stopped in. My dad walks in with Eddie Graham, and even though he was a friend of my dad's, he was still a celebrity back then, television wrestler. And, wow. So my father walks in with Eddie Graham. I'm like, wow, Eddie Graham's here. And I'm rehearsing this magic show on stage. And they walk in, and I told him, I said, Mr. Graham, may I borrow your handkerchief? So he hands me his handkerchief, and I tie a knot in the handkerchief, and I make the handkerchief start floating all over the stage, dancing all around and floating up above my head, and I'm doing all kinds of acrobatics. And then I grab the handkerchief, and I walk back over to Eddie Graham in the audience, and I hand him his handkerchief. And he's looking at it, and he and my father split. They take off. My father told me that after they left, Eddie Graham told him, or asked him, he said, tell me how he does it. Tell me how he does that magic trick. You're his father. Tell me how he does the magic trick. And my father told Eddie Graham, he goes, Eddie, I'm his dad, and he still doesn't reveal to me how he does his magic. And my dad said that a light bulb went off. And I think at that time, Eddie Graham realized that, well, if this kid is a magician and will not reveal the secrets of his magic to even his own father, then he will protect the secrets of the wrestling business. And about 2 weeks later, I got a call from the office, and I was 18 years old, and I started working at the wrestling office in Tampa. And I was working upstairs with Duke Kiyomuka, who Patrick Tanaka's father. I don't know if you recognize that name. Duke Kiyomuka was one of the most famous Japanese-style wrestlers in the 60s. He had a record. He and Fritz von Erich had a record of probably the most sellouts consecutively ever in Houston back in the late 60s. But I started working with him in the wrestling office, and that's another great story. Duke Kiyomuka was a legendary heel back in the 60s, and I can remember watching him when I was a little kid, and he would throw salt, in the eyes of his opponents, and he would use karate. He would cheat. and man, he was scary back in the day, and I can remember how they would protect the business so well that I remember on a couple of occasions that we ran into him at the mall, like on a Sunday. And of course, he was always dressed to the nines in a suit. I mean, he reminded me of Charlie Chan. And actually, I would imagine, sort of portrayed that character, And I remember him speak, because he recognized my father when we ran into him, and he would speak in broken English and bow repeatedly, the Japanese style, and he had the thick glasses and whatnot. And I remember the first day that I got hired to work at the wrestling office, be at the wrestling office Monday morning at 9. So I got there, ran upstairs, and there was sitting Duke Yamuka. And in perfect English, he says, "Hey, how you doing? Welcome, good to see you." And that was just kind of my first eye-opening experience in the wrestling profession. He sort of pulled the curtain back a little bit for me on that very first day. He's Duke Yamuka, the dangerous, scary heel. And he, of course, spoke perfect English. He was from Hawaii, actually. He was an American citizen. He portrayed a Japanese character in the 60s, the evil, post-World War II Japanese heel. But he, in fact, was an American citizen from Hawaii. And Mr. Fuji, the same way. He was also an American citizen, actually Hawaiian-born.